Hello everyone and welcome to my second of two videos on this, the Pentax P3N. In the first video we talked about what everything was and how to use the depth of field preview lever and the self timer. And in the second video we're going to talk about how to do everything else with this camera. Taking a photo, lenses, shooting in different modes, everything. Being an electronic camera, we can't do anything at all with this unless it has batteries. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to remove batteries and put new ones in. To remove batteries, simply put your finger on the battery cap and slide it toward the side of the camera. Now you can see two batteries in there. We're going to simply remove those. Now a word on button cell batteries really quickly. I use Duracell, basically exclusively, but any good button cell battery, Energizer, Sanyo, and Panasonic come to mind, are just fine. Don't use the no brand name ones that are like 25 of them cost the same as two Duracells. Those inexpensive ones that are on everybody's favorite online mega retailer have a tendency to swell and burst. They can leak inside your battery chamber, which can cause problems, and a swollen or burst battery can also break your battery chamber, which can cause other problems. Now, when you look in your battery chamber, this is what a clean one should look like. Okay, right in there. There should be no residue, no white gunk or anything like that. If you have any white crystalline gunk inside of your battery chamber, I do have a video on the channel that shows how to remove leaked battery alkaline goo with distilled white vinegar and rubbing alcohol. It's a pretty quick process, and as long as the circuitry hasn't been damaged by the leakage, you'll be just fine. What I mean by that is as batteries leak, they tend to leak from the negative terminal here, and the negative terminal faces into the camera, and then that alkaline crystalline goo that leaks out of them will follow electronics up into the cameras, and if it gets onto the circuitry, it can ruin a camera. So it's why it's a good reason not to store your batteries in here and not to let them burst. So we're going to put in the first battery, which is a 357 type battery, both of these are. And they're also called LR44s, 303s, AG13, S76, A76, I think there's a couple other names. You just load two of them in here like this with the positive terminal up, and the positive terminal is the one with the text. Push the battery cap down and then slide it into place, and you've changed batteries. Next thing I'm going to show you how to do is how to mount and unmount lenses. It's super simple. It's done the exact same way with every type of lens, whether you're using an SMC-K, SMC-M, SMC-A, or SMC-F or FA. Push down on the lens release button, turn the lens counterclockwise until it stops, and lift it off. You can do this at any time when you're not taking a photo, and all of your film will be fine. The shutter curtains in the back protect your film. To mount a lens, you find the red index and the red index, or you can also use the infinity focus point to line these up, or you can find this little white dot on Pentax brand lenses and line it up with the film release button right there. Drop it onto the lens mount and turn it clockwise until it clicks into place, and now you have mounted a new lens. Next thing let's talk about is how to load film in this camera and how film works in the Pentax P3N. To load film, we're going to first open the back of the camera. We're going to grab our roll of film. It must be DX coded. If it's not DX coded, like this film is not DX coded, the camera will assume it is 100 ISO. If your film is not 100 ISO and it's not DX coded, none of your photos will turn out properly. We're going to pull out a leader. We're going to set the film over here. I'm going to hold my fingers right over the sprockets and advance the film. And now, well, it was taken up. We're going to try that again. Press my finger over the sprockets, not push down, no pressure. They're just resting there. There we go. That should be enough, maybe. Maybe, we'll see. Okay. Close the back of the camera, and now let's take the slack out of the film like this, and let's watch this film knob here. If this spins, you have loaded your film correctly. We're going to advance 3 frames to the 0 frame right here. You advance 3 frames because you want to take the film that has been ruined and move it out away from the shutter area so that you can take your photo. If you want to be 100% certain that your first photo is going to be just fine, you advance to frame 1. I think with this camera you can get away with going just to frame 0. And then this number is how many frames you have taken. So we're going to go through our day. We're going to take our photos. We're going to use up our entire roll of film. And one thing I want you to know about film, it's very important if you're not familiar with it, is that film is one and done. You can use it a single time to create an image by having a proper amount of light reach the film with a proper shutter speed and aperture, and you get an image because the film absorbs the proper number of photons to create an image. Or you can have the film record all of the photons it receives in an uncontrolled manner like this. If you open up the back of the camera while you have film in it like this, you won't be able to see the images. They have to be developed for that first. But you will erase all of your images because the film will absorb every photon it possibly can. Any photos that have been taken will be gone. Any photos you could take, any film that is outside of the cassette here, will be erased to future photos because the film will never be able to absorb any more photons. So I want you to see how film works inside of your camera as it's advancing. If it's going to let me. There we go. So this camera does need to have some pressure put over the sprockets here. So let's see if I can do this. When you take a photo and you advance the film, what happens is you have unused film in the cassette. You take a photo, the shutter activates, and then this part of the film is exposed to light, and then you advance. Fresh film is pulled out of the cassette and moved in front of the shutter. That just repeats until you run out of film. When you run out of film, then you press the film rewind button down on the back. And if you remember in the first video, I said that this sprocket doesn't rotate backwards unless you press that button down. There had to have been a better way to design this. Holy cow. Okay, that's better. Now what you do is pop out this lever and start rewinding. And because you've pressed this button down, that sprocket spins freely and you can rewind the film all the way into the camera. Once you have finished rewinding the film, at that point, it's now safe to open up the camera and you can reach in here and take out your roll of film. If you're going to keep shooting, grab your next roll of film, drop it in, and start taking photos. If you're done for the day, close up your camera, trigger the shutter, and turn the camera off. And that's how film works inside of the Pentax P3N. Next up, let's do a little bit of a primer on flash use. Now, flashes with the Pentax P3N, there are some, maybe at this point, maybe most, if not all. I'm not sure how backwards compatible modern Pentax flashes are with Pentax film cameras, but Pentax flashes with the automatic aperture control, program flash AE mode, to the best of my knowledge, can all work with this camera in full program mode, which we'll talk about in a moment, and automatically tell the camera to shoot at the flash sync speed of 1/100th of a second. Okay, so that's with some Pentax flashes. What we're going to talk about here are really basic flash use principles with the most basic type of flash ever made. This has no automatic controls. If you have a flash like this or a non-Pentax flash, you can use it, generally speaking, on this camera, but you can only use it with manual controls and only with manual exposure. So first thing we're going to talk about is the flash sync speed, which is 1/100th of a second on this camera. It should also be anything slower. So anything from 1/60th to a second in bulb should also trigger the flash and work properly. 1/100th of a second is the fastest that the flash can be triggered and give you a proper exposure. And the reason for that has to do with the way that the shutter works. Now, I know that the shutter in this camera actually goes from top to bottom and then resets, but because I can't demonstrate that easily with my hands, we're going to pretend it goes left to right for the purposes of this demonstration. At 1/100th of a second, you're going to take a flash photo. You trigger the shutter, the first curtain opens, it reaches the other side of the camera. At this moment, the flash fires, and the entire film area is exposed to light for roughly 1/100th of a second. The second curtain closes behind it, and when you advance the film, they reset like that, okay? So that's the fastest shutter speed at which the entire film area is open to light. If you were to shoot this at, say, 1 full second, exact same principle. First curtain finishes its travel, the flash fires, the entire film is open to light for about a second, second curtain closes, and when you've advanced the film, they reset. So what happens at 1/1000th of a second? First curtain fires, second curtain comes in right behind it, and this little slit passes over the film between them. And if the flash fires at the end of the 1/1000th of a second shutter speed, when the first curtain finishes its travel, only this little slit is exposed to light, Everything else is blocked by the shutter curtains. So in this camera, you just have a thin little slit of light down at the bottom of the image, and everything else would be dark. So anything faster than 1/100th of a second, the entire film area is not exposed to light at the same time. Some part of the film is being covered by the shutter curtain, and so a flash will not illuminate the entire film area. So next up, let's talk about some basic flash technique. There's one way you can connect a flash to this camera. You can put it on top on the hot shoe like this, okay? This is the worst possible place to put a flash, right on top of the lens with the light pointing toward your subject. And the reason is because when you take a photo, the light leaves the flash like in a flat wall of light, bounces off your subject, comes back to your lens, and it makes your subject look flat and waxy, and if you're shooting color film, it will give them red eye. Terrible look. We grew out of this after the 90s. We should not go back there, okay? That's what happens with this flash orientation. But because the flash can only be mounted on top of the camera, you're somewhat limited in your options for flashes. And the problem with flash use on top of your camera like that is it doesn't give your subjects flattering light. What do I mean by flattering light? Well, the way that we see the world all the time is what we think of as being flattering for flash use. When we're outside, the sun is above us. At night, the streetlights are above us. Indoors, whether it's school or work or wherever, the overhead lights are, again, above us. With your flash, you want to use it to replicate light that we see as natural and flattering if you want your subjects to have the most flattering look. A really basic way to do that is to get a flash that has a tilting head. This way you can bounce the light of the flash off the ceiling, which is very useful. But if you shoot photos in places that don't have ceilings, like outside at outdoor weddings where there might be a wall next to you but no ceiling overhead, then some flashes also have a tilting head, a swiveling head rather. This one just tilts, but some can also swivel. And that swivel and tilt allow you to bounce the light off of a wall or a reflector or something like that and replicate that overhead light fairly well and come up with flattering lighting. With this camera, because you can only put a flash up here, it's a good idea to, at minimum, have one with a tilting head on it so you can replicate overhead lighting. And that's a really basic primer on how to use flashes with the P3N. Next up, we're going to talk about lens selection and shooting modes, okay? So there are 3 different shooting modes on this camera: full program, aperture priority, and full manual. With full program, the camera will choose the aperture and the shutter speed for you. With aperture priority, you choose the aperture and the camera will choose the shutter speed. With full manual, you choose both. So I'm going to show you first off full manual because we're in it right now. This lens, you can set the aperture however you want, and then you can set the shutter speed to whatever you want, and the camera will do what you tell it to, regardless of whether or not that's correct. If your shutter speed is one of these white digits, you are in full manual shooting. That's how you get into full manual shooting. There's no shutter priority on this camera, so if you grab a lens with an automatic aperture and then select a shutter speed here, you will not get shutter priority. You'll just get really terribly underexposed photos. So this is full manual. Let's say you wanted to go into aperture priority mode. All you have to do is hit A. And this is a Pentax SMC lens and this Pentax SMC-K. The same is true for it. These two lenses can do full manual and they can do aperture priority. And what you do is you simply select the aperture here with the shutter speed dial in A, and the camera will pick the best shutter speed for you. I'll show you. All right, so at f1.7 right now. Nice quick shutter speed. I'm going to set this down to f22, and this shutter speed should be a whole lot longer. You probably noticed the difference in shutter speed there. So what that shows us is that with this SMC-M lens, aperture priority mode works. Okay, that's really great, but you know what? I just got this camera. I really want to shoot in program mode while I just kind of learn how to make it work. That's fine. I'll show you how to do that. First thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the SMC lens because this cannot shoot in program mode. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab this Pentax SMC-FA 50mm lens. If you see SMC Pentax F, SMC Pentax A, or SMC Pentax FA, you can shoot in program mode with that. And the reason is because it has these contacts right here which communicate aperture. All of those lenses will also have an aperture ring that has an A right here so that you can put the lens into automatic aperture mode. We're going to mount the lens, and now we're in automatic aperture mode, automatic shutter mode. This is full program, okay? And it's going to deliver different apertures and shutter speeds for me, depending on lighting conditions. So let's see what it does if I point the lens at the camera. You can see the aperture closes down a little bit. If I block half of the lens, it should close down a bit less. It doesn't close down at all. So what that tells us is that the camera is using the light levels coming through the lens to determine the best shutter speed and aperture when you have A and A, and that's program mode shooting right there. So that's how you get into each of the 3 different modes with this camera and use them to take photos, and which lenses you have determine which modes are available to you. Next thing we're going to do, having discussed that, is talk about what's in the viewfinder of the camera and how to interpret the viewfinder information. This is a bit big. Oops. So in the viewfinder, when you look through the viewfinder, this is what you're going to see, okay? This is your matte focusing screen here, and we're going to talk about how to use this in a minute. And this is your meter display over here. We're going to talk about the meter display right now and how to interpret what it tells you in each of the different modes. First up, right up here up top, if you have a Pentax flash, it can usually communicate back to your camera when the flash is ready. That will light up when your flash is ready and you're going to take a flash photo. That's what that symbol means. These LEDs here will all alight at different times. P is green, M is red, 1/1000th through 1/60th are green, 30th through 1 are orange, okay? And when you are in program mode, which this camera is in right now, the green P will be illuminated. So that's how you know you're in program mode. When you go to take a picture, a shutter speed will illuminate. The camera is telling you which shutter speed it's going to use. It cannot tell you which aperture it's going to use, but it can tell you which shutter speed. So when you look in the viewfinder in program mode to take a photo, you know what shutter speed you're going to get. There you go. That's that. There's an M here. You might have remember there's 3 modes: program mode, aperture priority, and full manual. There's no A. That's correct. If both P and M are dark, you're in aperture priority mode. Rather, like this camera is now set to aperture priority mode. In aperture priority mode, when you use your camera, you're going to adjust the aperture on the lens, and these numbers will change, okay? So as you adjust the aperture, your shutter speed that you need to get a proper exposure will be different, and this will light up. In aperture priority mode, your objective, if you're hand holding the camera, is to get the green number, if you can. The green numbers indicate that you can hand hold the camera without shutter shake. The orange numbers indicate that you probably will or definitely will have shutter shake if you hand hold the camera. So that's aperture priority mode. It's just going to tell you what the shutter speed is, and if you know what your aperture is on your ring, then you also, your aperture ring on your lens, then you know what aperture you're going to be shooting at as well. If the red M is illuminated, now you're in full manual mode, rather like this, okay? The meter for full manual mode is a little bit different. What it's going to do is display 2 numbers. One will be solid and one will blink. The solid number is the shutter speed that you have selected on your shutter speed dial. The blinking number is the one that you need. So if 500 is solid, that's what you have the dial set to. If 15 is blinking, you actually need 15, so you either have to adjust the shutter speed to get down there or adjust the aperture to bring this number up here, okay? So that's how to understand that information. If in program mode or aperture priority mode, the 1000 or the 1 are blinking, what that tells you is that you have too much light. You cannot get a proper exposure with your film, your lens, and your shutter speed selection if this is blinking, or you have not nearly enough. You cannot get a proper exposure with your film, lens, and aperture when the 1 is blinking. So that's pretty much everything about the light meter. Next up, let's talk about how to use the focusing screen. There are 3 elements to this focusing screen. This whole area here is the focusing mat, this ground, what they call a ground glass, but that's a misnomer because it's actually plastic, but this matte field of glass, of plastic. And when you look through it, as you focus an image, your image will come into focus. So let's say you're going to take a picture of your friend, okay? Your friend's standing over here. They're really excited, big smile, big scenic thing over here, okay? If you want to take a photo where your friend is in focus and what's this big scenic thing is not perfectly in focus, but that's okay because your friend is the important part, focus your friend on the screen here, okay? What you're going to do is focus until your friend is in focus, and then what is in focus on the matte field will be in focus on your film. Okay, that's useful to know, but I mean, it's kind of a dim viewfinder and it's kind of small. I'm having trouble verifying if my friend is actually in focus that way. Okay, this is what's called a microprism collar here. And this is a focusing aid. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the camera position. We're going to put the microprism collar over our friend's face. As you adjust focus, when something is out of focus in the microprism, it's going to look really pixelated and blocky. And then when it's in focus, it's just going to snap right into focus. And so with this, you can use this as a focusing aid, verify focus because it's a little bit easier quite often to verify focus on this screen when you are looking at the microprism for fine details. I mean, that's really good, but I'm still not 100% certain that I'm getting this correct. All right, so we got a friend over here who's a stick figure. Use the split prism. You might put the center of the split prism over your stick figure friend's body. If the lines are not aligned, your friend is out of focus. As you focus the lens, the lines will come together, and when they are on top of each other like this, your stick figure friend's body is in focus. You can use this for any straight line. The rim of someone's glasses, a sign, a building wall, a wall, something like that. If you know that you have something on a plane to be in focus, like you have your friend leaning up against a wall, you could just use the edge of the wall in this split prism to obtain focus, okay? The use of the split prism is to get a vertical line and focus until it is vertical in the split prism, okay? So that's how you use the 3 different focusing areas of the focusing screen on this camera to obtain focus with the lens that you're using. So since we have talked a lot about exposure and focusing and images and everything, the next thing we're going to talk about is how to use the memory lock button. In current photography vernacular, this is called auto exposure lock, or AEL. It's the exact same thing. The way that this works is that this works to give you exposure, a correct exposure if your lighting conditions change, all right? So let's say, for instance, you're hanging out with a friend and you guys are sitting under the shade of a cafe, and it's like a really nice dark awning. It's very shaded where you guys are sitting. And then behind your friend is a cityscape or a beach or something that's really cool, and you want to remember sitting there with your friend. If you just line up that photo in the viewfinder, because this is center weighted, let's say your friend is over here to the side again, and you have this big bright scenic area here in the middle and off to this side, that's going to throw off your meter reading because it's center weighted. And what's going to happen is that this big scenic bright area outside of the shade will be properly exposed and your friend will be a dark block. So you want to prevent that because your friend is once again the important part of the image. In program mode or aperture priority mode only, what you do is you point the camera at your friend's face or down at the ground, at the sidewalk, at the concrete, whatever that's in the shade, and you take your meter reading, okay? You hold down the memory lock button, then you recompose your image as you want it, and you take the photo, and the camera will remember the aperture and shutter speed that it had in program or aperture priority mode and use those settings. Releasing memory lock erases the memory. So that's how you can use memory lock in complex lighting situations where you want something that's very dark to be properly exposed, and something that's very light can be blown out because that's easier to recover off of the negative than deep shadows. In full manual shooting, you don't need memory lock. You simply take a meter reading off the sidewalk or your friend's face. You dial in the settings as you want them to be, you recompose, and you take the photo. You don't need to use memory lock in full manual shooting, okay? Next thing let's talk about is how to take a photo with the Pentax P3N. It's pretty intuitive, and you've probably figured it out by now how to do it. First thing we're going to do after film is loaded is we're going to select the mode that we're going to shoot in. Manual mode, aperture priority mode, or program mode. Okay, whichever one you want to use, just fine. Next thing you're going to do is, if you're in program mode or aperture priority, you're simply going to dial in your focus, and once you're happy with your focus, take your photo. If you are in full manual mode, you adjust your aperture and shutter speed until you see only one shutter speed number blinking in the viewfinder. make sure you have focus, and take your photo. It's that simple. And then you advance your film. Okay, single photos are really easy. What about double exposures? Yes, you can do double exposures, but only in manual mode. Normally I would say, oh, I'll show you how to do it in program and aperture priority, but you cannot do a proper double exposure with program and aperture priority because you can't do exposure value compensation with this camera. Okay, so with manual, so I'm going to go over the mechanical approach to taking a double exposure, and then I'll explain the science behind it. When you take a double exposure, the first thing you want to do is take any slack out of your film, okay? Don't crank this and keep cranking like I'm doing right now. Just crank it until you get to the slack being taken out and you feel resistance. We're going to need this popped out in just a moment. Then you take your first photo, you press and you hold down the film rewind button on the back, you hold the film advance lever, and you advance the film. Next, you take your second photo, then you advance the film again. Now you're done, right? Well, no, not quite. The next thing you're going to do is set your shutter speed to 1/1000th, your aperture to f16 or 22, whatever is smallest. You put on your lens cap, or you set your lens so that the front of it is up against your leg, and you take a dead frame. The reason you take a dead frame is that when you disengage the advance gearing by holding down the film rewind button for your double exposure, what happens is that all of those gears come apart from, well, not apart, but they don't connect to each other. It takes them a moment after you start advancing the film again for them to re-engage fully. So you start advancing the film, but the film doesn't advance the whole way. You take your next photo, partially overlaps your double exposure, and potentially ruins both of them. To prevent that, you take a dead frame and then you advance your film, and it advances all the way outside of the shutter area so that your double exposure doesn't overlap your next frame. So that's an important thing to do right there. That's the mechanical aspect of it. What about the science aspect? Okay, this is where things get interesting because film is designed to only receive a certain amount of light to give you a proper exposure. So if you're going to take a double exposure, what you have to do is cut the light in half for each photo, and there are two ways to do that, okay? With the shutter speed dial or with the aperture. So you're going to take your light meter reading. All right, let's say, for instance, that your light meter reading says 1/60th at f5.6. You have the lens at f5.6. 1/60th is solid in your viewfinder. Great, let's take our double exposure. Not quite yet. We have to cut the amount of light in half. If we put 2 times the amount of light onto a single frame of film, your negative is going to be very dark and is called dark, thick, or dense, which are 3 words that mean the same thing. Your film got too much light. Positive is going to be very bright. And what happens is in traditional darkroom printing, you have very long print times and low contrast. And then your print times are made longer because you need contrast enhancing filters to restore that contrast. In digitization, you have very low contrast and very high digital noise. Both of those are bad situations. You want to cut the amount of light in half for each frame. These are all fractions on the shutter speed dial. These are all fractions too, we'll get to those in a minute, but these ones are easy to see. So if you want to get half as much light, you need to have half as long of a shutter speed, and half the time of 1/60th of a second is 1/125th. Every time you go up in a number, you cut the amount of light in half because you cut the amount of time in half. If you go down, you double the amount of time, you double the amount of light. So your double exposure at 1/60th needs to go to 1/125th. At 1/250th, it needs to go to 1/500th, okay? At 1/1000, you're kind of stuck. You can't do a double exposure unless you use the aperture. The aperture works basically the same way. Each time you go to the next number up, you cut the amount of light reaching the film in half. So if I have a 1/1000th of a second shutter speed that I need to use for my double exposure, I can go to f8 from f5.6 on the aperture ring, and the exact same thing, I've cut the amount of light in half. I do that for each of my 2 photos, and I have a proper exposure on my double exposure. This also applies, by the way, if you're going to use the flash and you want to use 1/100th, then you control the light coming into your double exposure with your aperture ring again, okay? So that's the science of the double exposure. All you have to do is make sure that each frame receives half as much light, which you can do by adjusting either the shutter speed or the aperture, but not both. And with that, we've gone over everything that the Pentax P3N can do. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in whatever video comes next.